Well, hi there. I didn't hear you come in. Welcome to my humble abode. Make yourself at home. I was just warming my cold self by the fire. What was that? The Lord of the Rings. You want to hear the story of the Lord of the Rings? You're in luck. You come to the right place. My friend Cody, he's a nerd. He's into that kind of stuff. He knows all about Lord of the Rings. But I can say this. It's not for the faint of heart. It's the second most based story ever told. Second only to the Bible. To know the story of the Lord of the Rings is really as big of an adventure as the Bible. And almost as important. It's important to know the story of the Lord of the Rings. How can you be red-pilled and not know the story of the Lord of the Rings? So sit back and relax. I'm going to get my nerdy friend Cody to explain to you what is the Lord of the Rings. And just introduce you to the world and tell you the basic story to get you ready for the telling of the tale of the Lord of the Rings. So, sit back and relax while Cody educates you. The Lord of the Rings is actually part of a bigger story, and the big story is what's called an allegory. An allegory is a story that's got a hidden meaning. It's got a lesson to it. And this story, the big story that the Lord of the Rings is part of, is the story of white people. The whole thing is supposed to represent the white race. But before I get to that, let me tell you where the Lord of the Rings comes from. The Lord of the Rings comes from an extremely based dude named J.R.R. Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien was born a long time ago. He fought in World War I. And then after that, he wrote 2.5 books. That's it. He only wrote 2.5 books. Now, some people say he wrote 5. But no, he did not. He wrote 2.5. First book that he wrote is called The Hobbit. And then after that, he wrote the sequel to The Hobbit, which is called The Lord of the Rings. But his publisher refused to publish The Lord of the Rings because his publisher said it was too long. And his publisher said you have to break it up into 3 smaller books. And so, reluctantly, against his will, Tolkien broke up The Lord of the Rings into 3 books. But it wasn't meant to be 3 books. It wasn't written that way. It was just written as one single big book called The Lord of the Rings. And then after that, he wrote half of a book called the Silmarillion or Silmarillion or some weird name. But he never finished that book. And so other people came after Tolkien died and tried to fill in the blanks. But obviously they aren't going to know what Tolkien was going to write. So they got it all wrong pretty much. Who knows? So it doesn't really count as a Tolkien book. There's really only just the Hobbit and the sequel, The Lord of the Rings. And then a long, long time after Tolkien died, another truly based individual from New Zealand named Peter Jackson took these books and made them into 6 movies. 3 Hobbit movies and 3 Lord of the Rings movies. Now, to make life nice and fun and exciting, Peter Jackson actually made them out of order. First, he made the Lord of the Rings movies in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then he waited like 10 years. And then he made the Hobbit movies, which came out just a few years ago. And why did he make them out of order? I don't know, but he did. So what I'm going to do is put them in order for you guys. So, I have told you where the stories come from. Now I'm going to introduce you to the world that they take place in. And then I'm going to wrap this video up with the basic backstory. So this all takes place in Middle-earth, which is supposed to basically be Europe. And it involves a collection of good guys and bad guys. Spoiler alert, the good guys are the white people. The bad guys are anyone who's not white. So, for the good guys, there's basically different races of white people, different types of white people. So first there's the elves. The elves are perfect. Think about when you were in high school, the friends you had that grew up and became engineers and lawyers and doctors. They always dress in perfect clothes and they have a perfect car and a perfect house and a perfect job and they're just perfect. Those kinds of white people are represented by the elves. And they're, like I said, pretty much perfect at everything they do. But, you know, deep down inside, they do pretty much think they're better than everyone else. They're not totally perfect, but they're pretty much perfect. And in Middle-earth, these elves live a long, long time. Some people say they're immortal, but they do appear to age, and they do appear to die. But instead of living 80 or 90 years, they live 80 or 90,000 years. They live a long time. And those are the elves. And then there's the men. The men are just like regular humans. They live about 80 or 90 years. And the men, they're also pretty awesome, but they're just rough around the edges compared to the elves. The men are basically the blue-collar workers of Middle-earth. The men are like the J of Middle-earth. Good people. Now, elves and men get along. They're friends with each other, but they don't ever have kids together, even though they can. A man and an elf can have a kid together, and the elf-man hybrid is basically just like a human, except they live a lot longer. So instead of living 80 or 90 years, the elf-man hybrid lives about 250 years. But still nowhere near as long as the elves that live like 80 or 90,000 years. And it's a big no-no for elves to hook up with men. But it does happen. And then there are the dwarves. The dwarves are the Jews of Middle-earth. They're really short, they have real big noses. All they do is they live in these underground cities. They carve out mountains and they live inside of hollowed out mountains. And all they do is obsess over gold. And they're real selfish. They're good people, they're just selfish. And they're really hard workers. But they only work hard for themselves. They don't like working for others. So remember that friend that I met, that had you meet? Classic. Do you remember the guy, the Jewish guy who lived in the back of that car lot and just wrecked cars for a living? That guy works his ass off. That guy is an extremely hard worker, but just for himself. So that guy is a perfect example of a dwarf. And in the Lord of the Rings, in the Hobbit, the dwarves are considered good guys. The dwarves are not the bad guys, but they definitely cause lots of problems. And so the elves and the dwarves don't get along very well, because the dwarves cause lots of problems. There's no denying that. And that's the dwarves. And last but not least are the hobbits. The hobbits are the classic Americana of Middle-earth. The hobbits are just short, simple people who like to live a simple life, and they like to smoke pot. They smoke pot all the time. They like to drink beer. They like to work in the garden. And they don't have grand militaries. They don't have any military. They're just good, simple, decent country folk. And the elves wear shoes on their feet. The men wear shoes on their feet. The dwarves wear shoes. Everyone wears shoes except the hobbits are always barefoot because they have these super feet that are covered in hair. So they're always barefoot. And they're really short. So they're like little mouse people or something. And they're able to sneak around really well because of that. They're really light on their feet. And that's the hobbits. And those are the 4 different races in Middle-earth that are supposed to represent different types of white people. Now, in addition to these 4 races of different types of white people that are entire big giant races with men and women and families, and there's lots and lots and lots of each of them. There's lots of elves, lots of men, lots of dwarves, lots of hobbits. Some of them live out in the wild. Most of them live in little villages or big cities. But in addition to those 4 races, there are these 3 wizards. And there's not a race of wizards, there's just these 3. They mention others, but I guess they're gone, I don't know. There's only these 3 in the story. There's Gandalf the Grey. He is the wandering wizard. And his job is just to wander around and keep an eye on the little villages of men and dwarves and hobbits, and to just keep an eye on everybody, keep an eye on things. And then there's Radagast the Brown. His job is to keep an eye on nature. He lives out in the woods with all of the wildlife, and his job is just to keep an eye on the natural world. And then there's Saruman the White. And he is the boss of the wizards. So his job is to keep an eye on Radagast and Gandalf. And it doesn't seem like he has anything else to do. So he's the boss. Now, in the movies, there's two things that the director changed. And I don't know why, but there's two things he changed. And one of them is Saruman. In the books, he's not Saruman the White. He doesn't wear white. In the books, he's Saruman the Multicolored. So his robe should literally look like the LGBT flag. And that's what he's supposed to look like. The director, for whatever reason, changed it to just white. When he should be Saruman the Multicolored. That's what he's called in the book. And that would actually be perfect for his character because Gandalf the Grey is a hardcore conspiracy theorist. And his boss, Saruman the White, is a totally blue-pilled normie who doesn't like hearing Gandalf's conspiracy theories. And so it would be perfect if he was walking around in a gay flag because he's a blue-pilled normie. That's who he is. But for whatever reason, the movies made him just wear white. And those are the three wizards that help out with the four races. In addition to all of that, there's the eagles. The eagles are just big giant eagles that are real intelligent. But they're real finicky and they really keep to themselves. They only help Gandalf. They don't help anybody but Gandalf. And even that, they don't help Gandalf very often. And there's also like magic horses. And they only really like Gandalf and they only help Gandalf. And then there are these big giant talking trees. But again, they only really like Gandalf. Gandalf is a popular guy. And then there are the bad guys. There's no bad elves, there's no bad hobbits, there's no bad dwarfs, and almost all the men are good, but there are some bad men. Now I know I said that all of the white people are all the good guys, but I lied. There's two really small groups of white people that are actually bad. There's the wild men, and then there's the pirates. And then the only other bad guys are the Haradrim. And there's a whole army of them. And clearly they're not white, they're brown skin in the movies. They look like Persians. They dress like Persians. I think they're supposed to be Persians like Xerxes from the movie 300. And those are the only bad men. But there's only a very small number of wild men, and there's only a very small number of pirates. There's a big giant army of the Haradrim, but that's it. And then there are these creatures that look just like men. They walk around on legs and they've got hands and stuff, but they're pretty grotesque. Most of them are called orcs. The orcs are different shades of gray. They're mostly dark gray, and they're a little bit shorter than men, but they're basically like hunched over men as far as how big they are. And the orcs live in a big giant military. That's all they are, is just a big military. There doesn't appear to be any female orcs. There's just male orcs. And they're just in this one big giant military. And then there's the white orcs. Those are the big badass orcs. The little orcs always answer to a white orc. So whenever there are orcs, there's always a big white orc in charge of a bunch of smaller black orcs. And then there's the Uruk-hai. The Uruk-hai are like special forces orcs. They're not quite as badass as the white orcs. The white orcs are the toughest of all the orcs, but the Uruk-hai are definitely second. And then there's the goblins. The goblins are real short. Like a man is to a hobbit what an orc is to a goblin. It's just like a little short little orc, basically. And they mostly live underground, and they're not really all that dangerous compared to the other orcs, but they're still dangerous. And they have a goblin king. Now remember I said the movies changed two things? One thing they changed is they made Saruman the multicolored into Saruman the white. Well, the other thing they changed is the goblin king. He's supposed to be just another goblin, just like all the rest of them. He's supposed to be a little bit bigger, but for the most part he's supposed to be just a regular goblin. But for whatever reason, the movies made him this giant, huge thing when he's not supposed to be. He's supposed to be just like all the other goblins. So I'm not sure why the movies changed that. And then there's the trolls. The trolls are really big and really strong and really stupid. And those are the creatures that are similar to men. So the orcs are all really bad, and they're all in this big military, and they pretty much worship these things from thousands of years ago. There's these things called the Nazgul, the Ring Race, the Nine, and they were these super elite soldiers that died a long, long time ago. And then the Dark Lord Sauron was this supremely powerful evil sorcerer who also died a long, long time ago. And the orcs basically worship him. And then there are the monsters. They're these big wolf-looking things called wargs that the orcs ride on like horses. There are giant spiders. There's a big fire-breathing dragon. There are these giant worm things that pop out of the ground. There is this big octopus-looking thing. There is a freaking demon, actual demon. And then a really, really, really big spider that's even bigger than the other big spiders. And then smaller dragons. And those are the monsters of Middle-earth. But there's not that many of them. There's either only one of those things or just a small number. Except for the wargs. There's lots of those wargs that they ride around on. But other than that, there's only a small number of all of those monsters. And that concludes your introduction to Middle-earth, both good and bad. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's not all that important that you remember all those details about all those different creatures and races. Just know that it's all a big metaphor for white people. So now I'm going to run through the basic backstory. But just remember, this whole thing is a metaphor for white people, but also for good and evil. And you need to know the story in order for it to make sense. But the story isn't as important as the lesson that it teaches. And It's a very powerful lesson about good and evil, and it all centers around this ring. This ring was made by the devil, basically, and this ring has the power to corrupt anybody. Just about anybody will give in to the temptation of this ring. This ring is all about temptation. And if you have the ring, some people just instantly give in to the evil of it. Others resist for a while, but just about everybody eventually gives in to the power of the ring if they have it. And the ring will twist and manipulate their mind and take over their soul pretty much, and then eventually over time the ring will transform their body into a perverse, weird version of whatever they used to be. And so the whole story is the story of this ring, pretty much. Although there is a side quest. There is a side quest that is relatively unrelated to the ring. So, in a nutshell, there is this spirit that just flies around in the universe. And this spirit plays music. And with this music, the spirit is able to create things. And it creates stars, and it creates planets, and then it starts creating races of different beings, different people. For whatever reason, it seems like every time it creates a new race, it creates a race with less power than the last race it just created. So it creates all these races, and the first race it creates is extremely powerful. The next race it creates is less powerful. The next race it creates is less powerful, and so on and so forth until eventually it creates the Hobbits. Why it's doing it that way, I don't know. So the first race that it created were these 7 spirits that fly around in the universe with him, playing music with him, helping him to create stuff. And then after that, this spirit created this planet. Not the Earth, but some other planet. And created this race of super elves to live on that planet. So as powerful as the elves of Middle-earth are, these other elves are even more powerful and have even more abilities. And then this spirit created the Earth, and then the elves of the Earth, of Middle-earth. And for whatever reason, when this spirit did that, it really upset one of those 7 angels. And it also upset one of those super elves on that other planet. Now, why it upset one of those fallen angels, one of those angels, or one of those super elves, I don't know, but it did. And so one of those angels came to Earth to defeat the elves. So it was a fallen angel. Very, very powerful. And also, one of those super elves came to Earth to help this fallen angel to defeat the elves of Earth. And that super elf was this extremely handsome elf named Sauron. Lord Sauron. And Lord Sauron and the fallen angel were teamed up trying to destroy the elves of Middle-earth. But they were very tricky about it. The fallen angel just attacked the elves, and he created dragons and demons and all kinds of monsters. The earth was like this paradise before he showed up, and he created all these monsters to attack the elves. But Lord Sauron, he pretended he was there to help the elves. And so Lord Sauron was actually double-crossing the elves, because he was there to help the fallen angel. And so he taught the elves how to make these rings of power. And he helped the elves to make these 3 rings of power. And what these rings do exactly, the books never really explain. They just seem to, whatever, power that elf has, if the elf has on one of these rings, then it's even more powerful. And then the spirit found out what was happening on the earth and wanted to help. So he created the dwarves and he created men to help the elves to defeat the fallen angel. So then Lord Sauron helped the dwarves to make rings of power. So then the dwarves had rings of power, and then Lord Sauron helped men to create rings of power. So then elves had rings of power, and dwarves had rings of power, and men had rings of power. And then in secret, Sauron got this fallen angel to help him make a master ring that was so powerful it could control the other rings. And he was able to do that in secret with the help of this fallen angel. So the ring has in it the evil of that fallen angel and Sauron. So the ring is just pure evil. And so Sauron put the ring on, and slowly but surely over time it transformed him from being this handsome elf to being this giant monster looking thing. And then those 9 men who got rings of power, they were great kings of men, and Sauron gave them rings of power, and one by one they slowly gave in to the power of the one ring, and slowly but surely they all became slaves to Sauron. And then Sauron's magic transformed them from being regular men to being like him, these monster-looking things. And that's where the Nazgul come from. That's where the 9 come from, the ring race. And then the elves and the dwarves and the men were able to defeat this fallen angel, and with the help of those other spirits out in space, those spirits came and got this fallen angel and took him away to a remote planet, a barren wasteland, and chained him up in the bottom of a cave and sealed the cave shut so he could never escape. And so the fallen angel was defeated. But the dragons and the demons were still around that he created. And also Sauron and his 9 Nazgul were still around with the 1 ring of power. So then Sauron went and hid after the fallen angel was defeated and started creating the orcs. And it doesn't really explain exactly what an orc is. The books just say they used to be elves, and then Sauron made them into orcs, and now they reproduce. They do reproduce, but there are no women, there are no orc children, and when an orc is born, they're born fully grown. They're born fully grown adult orcs. And so, anyway, Sauron creates a big army of orcs. And then, after a long time of waiting, Sauron tries to defeat the elves and the dwarves and the men. Lord Sauron, who is all twisted and evil at this point, tries to do what the fallen angel could not do. And Lord Sauron is defeated, and the ring of power is lost. So the men and the elves team up and they defeat Sauron. When they did, a little side note is the king of Gondor asked these men to come and help fight Sauron, and they swore that they would. But then when they actually went to go fight Sauron, those men ran away, and it really pissed off the king. So the king put a curse on them so that they would never be able to die. And so they just became ghosts, and they're just up in these hills and these caves. They're these ghosts. But other than that, it was pretty much a victory for the men and for the elves, because they defeated Sauron, and the orcs went and hid. And then 3,000 years go by, and it's Bilbo Baggins' 111th birthday. Now, at some point in that 3,000 years, the goblins take over one of the dwarfs' cities. Remember, the dwarfs live in these underground cities. And remember, the goblins are like the little short little orcs. Well, the goblins decide they want to hide out in this dwarf city, so they take it over. They kill a bunch of the dwarfs and they kick the rest out and they take it over. And so the goblins are just down in this dwarf city. And it doesn't say when that happens, you just know it happened at some point in that 3,000 years between when Lord Sauron is defeated and when Bilbo Baggins has his 111th birthday. And then also before that, this other dwarf city, the Aramor, the Lonely Mountain, gets attacked by a big fire-breathing dragon. And he does the same thing. He kills a bunch of the dwarfs and then kicks the rest out. So then those dwarfs decide to try to go to Moria and take it back from the goblins, because they figure it would be easier to defeat those goblins than it would be to defeat that dragon. So they abandon the Lonely Mountain and they go to the ancient dwarf city of Moria and try to take it back over from the goblins. But when they get there, there's literally a freaking army of orcs there to help the goblins, which is really weird because there shouldn't be any armies of orcs because they were defeated when Sauron was defeated. And they were not all wiped out, but there should not be big giant armies of them popping up out of nowhere to defend the goblins. So there's some really weird stuff going on underground in these dwarf cities. And these dwarf cities keep getting taken over by goblins and dragons. And then whenever the dwarfs try to take their city back, some mysterious army of orcs show up out of nowhere. And that gets Gandalf's attention. Because Gandalf, the wandering wizard, his job is to wander around and just keep an eye on everything. And he starts hearing conspiracy theories about what's going on in these dwarf cities. And so he gets together with some dwarfs and they have a little side quest, a little side mission that's not really related to the ring, although it kind of sort of is. And at the end of that side quest, Bilbo is 111 years old, which is abnormally old for a hobbit. And that little side quest, which is the adventure of Bilbo Baggins, is The Hobbit. One good thing about these movies is that every single character is played by the same actor in all 6 movies, so it's never confusing, with one exception, and that is that Bilbo is played by one actor when he's 111 years old, and then he's played by a different actor in the flashback when he's younger. And then after that side quest, 60 years go by, and it's Bilbo's 111th birthday. And that's the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. It starts on Bilbo's 111th birthday. And in the last 60 years since The Hobbit ended, he has adopted his nephew, Frodo. And so Frodo lives with Bilbo. And this all begins on Bilbo's 111th birthday. So during the time that Bilbo and Frodo live, Middle-earth is pretty much ruled over by the elves. The queen of the elves is Lady Galadriel, and she's pretty much the queen of all of Middle-earth. And all the elves, they live in these 3 cities. They live with her, and then they live with these 2 guys. The brown-haired guy is pretty nice. The blonde-haired guy, he's kind of like an Aryan elf. Those blonde elves are really full of themselves. And then also, during the time of Bilbo and Frodo, the men mostly live in these 2 big kingdoms, Gondor and Rohan. And the king of Rohan is really old and has gone crazy. And the king of Gondor is missing. The king has been missing from Gondor for a long, long time. So instead of a king, they have a steward who's supposed to rule until the king returns. But the steward of Gondor is really mean and is also a little bit crazy. And there's only one dwarf city left in the Iron Hills, and so there's really only one king of the dwarves. But in that lonely mountain, this guy used to be the king before the dragon showed up.
And I don't know who was the king in the Moria before the goblins showed up, but that happened a long time ago. So these are pretty much the dwarf kings. And the dwarves hate the elves, especially the Aryan elves. The Aryan elves don't particularly like the dwarves either, the Jews of Middle-earth. And the Jews of Middle-earth, the dwarves, have the elves, the crown jewels of the elves. And they've had them for a long time, and no one really knows why they have the crown jewels of the elves. But the elves want their crown jewels back. And the dwarves say the elves are in debt to them, and that the elves owe them payment for something from a long time ago. But the elves say, bullshit, we don't owe you anything. And so the dwarves are holding on to the crown jewels of the elves until they get paid. But the elves refuse to pay them. So they just hate each other. And that is pretty much the backstory. So I've told you where these stories come from. I've introduced you to the world itself. And I have told you the backstory. But just remember, what really matters is that it's all just a big metaphor for white people. And it's all a big metaphor for good and evil. And the ring just represents temptation. It represents evil. And true evil is very subtle and very tempting. It gets inside of your head. So, I hope you enjoy your movie marathon.
What? Is Cody finally done rambling on? Man, that guy's one hell of a fucking nerd, isn't he? I mean, that was fascinating. I can't wait for my Middle-earth movie marathon. Happy birthday, Cody.